We are here to discuss ICH Q9, Quality Risk Management. Now, this document was felt necessary because in the estimation of the regulators, both they as well as the manufacturers were not prioritizing or focusing on the important few and instead have been frittering away their resources on the insignificant many. Now, where does this come from? Louis Vincent or Winifredo Pareto, an Italian, in some other context, had mentioned or lamented actually that isn't it a pity that 80% of Italy's wealth is controlled or in the hands of 20% of the Italians. That's all he had said. That was about 200 odd years ago. But what he said was so profound that it has become an axiomatic truth of life. 20% cause, 80% effect. That's the way most of us know it today and apply it as today. Take the regulator. Now, if you are in the US and have been approved for some formulation or the other, now whether you're a paracetamol manufacturer, a topical ointment, a ear drop, or a life-saving drug, or an anti-cancer, anti-neoplasty category of drug, or insulin, the regulator is obliged to inspect you every 2 years. But now, he feels that he has been wasting his resources. He feels that his priority should be to be governed by the risk to the patient. First, this drug, this formulation, how critical is it for the patient? If it is very critical, yes, we give it the priority it deserves. And if it is not critical, then we can afford to place this manufacturer or this product at a lower priority. That is one. How important is the formulation, the drug, for the patient? The second thing he would like to consider is the availability of the drug in the marketplace, the supply position. How many manufacturers are there for this formulation? If there are very many, then if one or two manufacturers exit, it is not likely to compromise the patient. But if there are very, very few manufacturers of this very critical drug, then those manufacturers, that drug deserves to be high on FDA's priority to ensure that the drug's availability is guaranteed. And lastly, what is the history of this manufacturer vis-a-vis compliance? Now, if you've been inspecting him over the years, how do you rate his compliance level? If he has always been very high on compliance, then he is unlikely to put the patient at risk. But if his compliance history is checkered, then the FDA would like to pay more attention to such a manufacturer to ensure that he remains in compliance. So they themselves have felt that if they want to serve their community effectively, they should first learn to focus on the critical few, the important few, and not fritter their resources away on the not so critical ever so many. They have put forth two primary principles. The evaluation of the risk to quality should be based on scientific knowledge and ultimately linked to the protection of the patient. And the second principle is the level of effort, formality, and documentation of the quality risk management process should be commensurate with the level of the risk. Now, let me state here that while any business may have ever so many areas of concern vis-a-vis risk, for example, market risk, business risk, competitive risks, the ICH-Q9, while acknowledging that there may be more than one source of risk, is intent on confining itself to the risk to the patient, not any other risk. But having said that, if your drug is likely to place a patient at risk, it first means it has gone out of your door. Otherwise, how would the patient have access to your product? So it has gone out of your door, it is in the marketplace, and there it is likely to put patients at risk. Really also means it is going to place your business, your very existence, at risk. So there is something called liability to the company every time a product goes out and is likely to place any patient at risk. So the two are really interconnected. So in my discussions, if I keep saying liability to the company, it does not mean I'm not concerned about the risk to the patient. I'm only saying any liability to the company is linked to the risk to the patient in the marketplace. So high risk exposure of the company would be only because the patient is likely to be placed at high risk. And if the risk exposure of the company is low, you infer that it's unlikely to cause any serious harm to any patient in the marketplace. Now let's go back to understand what Winifredo Pareto or Vincent Pareto, whatever his name was, really said in practical terms. It means that if there are 100 people outside your door or compound wall shouting slogans, and if you were to go there and physically check out who is shouting, you're likely to find that if there are 100 people outside, 80% of the slogans are being shouted at by 20% of those present there. Let me elaborate a little further. If those 100 are throwing stones, hurling stones into the compound, and if you were to pick up each one of those stones and assume that each stone had the person who threw it, his name written there, assuming, and if you were to collect those 100 stones that came in and sort them, you're likely to find that 80% of those stones came from 20% of the people. In other words, 80 stones were hurled by 20 people if there are 100 stones and 100 people. This is the underlying truth. Now, this is not what Vincent Pareto said, but I am saying that if you were to look at those 80 stones that came from 20 people, you're likely to find that 50% of the stones came from 5% of the people. In other words, 5 people have thrown approximately 10 stones each. The remaining 15 people together collectively threw 30 stones. Now, even in those 15, the 80-20 principle works. In other words, out of 15, 20%, there is 3 people, have thrown 80% of the stones. That is 24 stones. That means each guy has on an average thrown 8. And the remaining 12 people collectively have thrown in the remaining 6. In other words, every second person has thrown 1 stone. Apart from the 80 stones that came in, the remaining 20 stones have come from 80 people there. Effectively means every 4th guy has thrown 1 stone. So here we have 5 people throwing 10 stones, another 3 people throwing 8 stones, another 12 people throwing half a stone, 2 persons, 1 stone, and the last 20 people, the last 80 people, the last 80 people have collectively thrown 20 stones, which really means every 4th person has thrown 1 stone, each person has thrown quarter stone. So what do we see? Quarter, half, 8 and 10. That is the way in which the stones have arrived. Now, why are we talking about stones? It's not, it's just to illustrate the point. In the pharmaceutical industry, you may have 100 issues. 100 issues that could take, 100 issues that could place the patient at risk. But all the 100 issues are not likely to place the patient at the same level of risk. In fact, 80% of your issues would have hardly any effect vis-a-vis risk to patient. And it's only 20% of the issues that you face that are likely to place the patient at a high level of risk. So I repeat, if there are 100 issues that you as a pharmaceutical manufacturer are facing, confronting, not all of them are likely to place the patient at the same level of risk. In fact, 80% of them would have very low impact on the patient vis-a-vis placing him at risk. You worry now only about those 20 issues that might have some kind of an effect on the patient and place him at some level of risk or the other. Now, going one step further, you'll find that there are just 5 issues which are very critical indeed, followed by another 3 issues which is just as critical, almost as critical. And then you will have the remaining 12 issues, which is less than moderate vis-a-vis placing a patient at risk. In other words, you will learn to prioritize. QRM talks about risk to the patient. But the same concept applied as prioritization of everything each one of you at each level does will help the entire organization to organize itself to see that at the appropriate level, appropriate decisions are taken, and that the senior management doesn't get swamped with a whole pile of issues that could have been addressed satisfactorily at a much lower level in the organization. Now, QRM has suggested a certain model which is on the lines of ISO 14971. And ISO 14971 is not new. The device manufacturers have been following their quality system regulation, has generally been modeled along the ISO 14971 for over 2 decades. It's only the drug industry that the risk profiling, risk management has not been in place or practiced to manage quality. Quality risk management has 4 elements. The first is risk assessment. Assess what is the risk. What can place the patient at risk. Then comes the phase of risk control. Risk control would be followed by the quality risk management final results. And lastly, once this is done and completed, you keep going back to review the risk over a period of time. So we have risk assessment, risk control, QRM results, and review of the risk profile over a period of time for the entire duration of your existence or your product's existence in the market. Risk assessment itself has 3 elements. First is the risk identification. Next is the analysis of that risk. And finally is the evaluation of that risk. Risk identification, risk analysis, followed by risk evaluation. This completes what is called risk assessment. Under risk control, you have risk elimination. That's your first priority. Can you eliminate that risk? If you cannot eliminate that risk, then can you mitigate that risk? Can you reduce the level of risk? And risk elimination or risk mitigation could be through first preference, elimination or mitigation by design. If that is not possible, elimination or mitigation by automation. And if that is also not possible, try and eliminate that risk or reduce that risk through procedural controls, systems and practices. Once you have reduced the risk, check or eliminate it. If you have eliminated the risk, there is no issue. But if you have reduced the risk, check whether the level to which you have reduced it is acceptable. Acceptable to the patient, acceptable to the regulators, acceptable to all stakeholders. Once you reach this point, it is called risk communication. This is where the QRM results are communicated to all the stakeholders and their acceptance obtained. When this has been done, you go into that last phase, continuing phase, I should say continual phase of risk monitoring and review. In the process of eliminating a risk or reducing a risk, have you now introduced any new risk that was not there earlier? And if so, how do you propose to address these new risks that have emerged with the elimination or reduction of the earlier risks? This, by and large, is the model on which QRM is to be implemented. Now, whether you should really go into a formal QRM exercise will be determined by whether you already have clear rules for decision making. If you already have clear rules for decision making, then a formal QRM exercise is not really required or called for, and you have to only document the results, decisions and actions that are taken as they are taking place or as it is proposed to be handled. If you have very clear idea about what the risks are likely to be and how severe and how they can be either eliminated or reduced, you already have it clear in your mind, then you don't need a formal QRM process. But if you've never done this before, there are no clear rules. You're not very clear about, you're not clearly identified all the sources of risks, then it's best that you form a small project team and go about it along the lines that I shall take up